For more, we are joined by Dr. Matthew Sussex, Associate Professor from Griffith University and Visiting Fellow at the Australian National University. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. So given the context of Mr. Trump's potential meeting with Mr. Putin and his discussions with both the Russian leader and Zelensky, how likely is it that some kind of deal to end or even pause the war in Ukraine could emerge soon?
Well, I think it's probably a little bit too early to say definitively, whether we'll get a ceasefire, much less an end to the war. I think this intervention by President Trump is certainly an attempt to make good on his campaign promise that he could end the war within 24 hours, which then subsequently became 100 days, and may well push out beyond that. I think a lot of it depends really on how involved Ukraine is in this peace process. There are suggestions that the United States and Russia will just talk directly to one another. Now, of course, if you're in Kiev and you're President Zelensky and not invited to those peace talks, then you're not necessarily bound by anything that might be agreed to by Washington, D.C. or the Kremlin. So your response could simply be, well, we're going to fight on. And that in turn will depend on the extent to which the United States is prepared to continue funding Ukraine in terms of helping it militarily and with humanitarian aid, and also European countries as well, which have, as you've noted, have made very significant contributions to Ukraine since Russia invaded.
Professor Sussex, help me make sense of this. During Trump's first few days in office, he threatened to impose new sanctions, new tariffs on Moscow if Putin didn't reach a deal to end the war. But now it seems like a different strategy at play, efforts to improve the relationship. Why this about face?
Well, look, Trump is well known for doing 180-degree shifts in what he says and what he does. I think the initial talk of strength was one that was certainly welcomed by European leaders and in Ukraine as well. But it was kind of difficult to see exactly what kind of tariffs the United States could place on Russia that would cause it any significant grief. The outgoing Biden administration had already effectively thrown the sanctions book at Moscow in its final days by saying it was going to go after Russia's shadow fleet of oil tankers, which it's been using to, of course, sell oil to circumvent sanctions. So it might be a realization in the Trump administration that, well, we have few opportunities for leverage over Moscow. Let's try a Moscow-friendly approach. But of course, in doing so, the Trump administration has sent enormous ripples throughout every NATO member and frankly, probably US allies within Asia as well, who think, well, is it the case that this new administration will come down on the side of, effectively autocrats who invade other countries?
I want to just go back to your point of concerns of Ukraine being sidelined from these talks, Professor. And how do you think Mr. Zelensky is viewing Mr. Trump's engagement with Putin? And what kind of concessions might he be willing to offer to bring an end to the war?
Yeah, well, I expect he'd be fairly disconcerted by the statements out of the Trump administration that there would be no Ukrainian membership in NATO, that there would be no American military presence in Ukraine, and that European countries are going to have to fill the gap in terms of aid delivery, because effectively that's giving away, before negotiations even start, some of the big trump cards that the United States had to play. So I'd imagine Zelensky would not be very happy with that. Now, very recently, there have been reports out of Kiev that Zelensky is prepared to trade land for peace. But where that land is of course yet to be decided, and how a ceasefire would be monitored, and what happens also to the territory that Ukraine controls in Russia, because of course Ukraine Ukrainian forces last year staged a quite daring assault into Russian territory, and they continue to hold that territory. So you would have to assume that would have to be part of any peace deal as well. And all the more reason why Ukraine, of course, would need to come to the table to negotiate.
And Professor, Mr. Trump is known for his unorthodox diplomacy, such as his summits with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, for example. Some suggest that unpredictable leaders may need equally unconventional counterparts for negotiations to succeed. Would you agree? Just how valid is this theory in case of Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin?
Yeah, I mean, it may well be that that the unconventional method and the unconventional partnerships win out, but certainly for the last 20 years or so, Russia has been no friend to the United States. Russia has seen it as an enemy and has said on numerous occasions it is at war with NATO and at war with the US. So this would be quite a significant turnaround in what has been some fairly consistent policy coming out of Russia. And I guess the other question is, to what extent can we trust that a ceasefire will hold? Previously, Putin has shown absolutely no enthusiasm whatsoever for peace negotiations. And he knows himself, I think, that he can simply sort of keep the war ticking along and try and wait out the US administration until it eventually caves and says, look, ultimately we'll give Moscow what it wants. That in turn would put pressure on Kiev to make more concessions, but they'd be just as likely to push back against them. So, while it would be nice to be optimistic that this conflict, the end is in sight, I think there's a lot of water that needs to flow under the bridge before we can definitively say that.
Okay, Professor Sussex, we'll have to leave it there for now, but thank you very much for your time. Dr. Matthew Sussex, Associate Professor from the Griffith University and Visiting Fellow at the Australian National University.